Hello, I'm Andrea Gonzalez with Trellis Strategies, and we really appreciate you joining us for our discussion today. You have tuned in to the From Work First to Workforce First Strategies webinar. We're going to be exploring how some states treat public benefits as tools for success rather than obstacles by aligning benefit policies to support education, completion, and workforce participation. You're welcome to share in the chat as you're filing in where you're tuning in from. That'd be great to see. And we also welcome you to engage through questions throughout the webinar. You can put those in the chat or in the Q&A, and at the end of the presentation, we will address those questions. Things are looking pretty steady. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our Senior Policy Strategist, Carrie R. Welton.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Appreciate you joining us today. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us to talk about how states are moving from work first to workforce first strategies and why doing so is going to be increasingly important. I would really like to thank my colleagues, Jennifer and Caroline, for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Carrie Welton. I've been with Trellis Strategies since the beginning of June. And you're going to hear from both of my colleagues after I spend about 10 minutes setting some of the foundation for this conversation with data and insights. Then Carolyn will join us to more thoroughly introduce herself and her organization and to add some additional context, followed by Jennifer, who will do the same. And then we'll spend about 10 minutes as a panel discussing what we're seeing in states, and we'll reserve the remainder of the time to answer your questions, which you can submit, as Andrea mentioned, through the chat or the Q&A function. If you don't know us, Trellis is a trusted research and technical assistance firm with nearly 40 years experience in higher education. We specialize in qualitative and quantitative research and alignment strategies that support institutions and states in developing economic mobility and workforce outcomes. We know that the pathway of the modern learner is rarely linear. Interruptions, restarts, and shifts in direction are common, reflecting the complex interplay of education with work, finances, and personal responsibilities. These nonlinear journeys reflect the persistence and determination of these learners, and by understanding their experiences, we can better support progress, reentry, and completion. So let's talk a little bit about barriers beyond tuition. And I'm a nerd, so I can't help but include all of these data points, but I will not be going over them today. We are happy to provide these slides to you after this session in a PDF format. And you can also revisit this session through the recording, which we'll send out afterwards as well. But what this slide really conveys is that cost overall is cited as the biggest barrier to enrollment completion. But what we're increasingly seeing is that it's not just the cost of tuition and the lack of financial aid. We're increasingly seeing that people are reporting that personal financial circumstances and related mental health and stress challenges are the prominent barrier. But this must be particularly disheartening for states and institutions who have worked diligently to bring down the cost of tuition and fees. And we see that when adjusted for inflation, tuition and fees have actually declined over the past 10 years. So I really wanted to unpack what is driving some of these challenges. And what we know, what has not declined that we've all experienced personally, are living expenses. This chart represents only a 4-year time period from 2020 to 2024. And what we see is that costs are up across all of these categories about 21%, with transportation having risen the most, followed closely by food and housing. So it's unsurprising that people are reporting not only educational challenges, but are struggling to make ends meet overall, particularly for those who have not completed a degree or credential. And this context helps explain why people are struggling to enroll and complete. We see that tuition and fees are a small proportion of the overall cost of attendance. Tuition and fees represent only about 40% of cost for students at four-year public colleges and universities, and about 20% of the cost for community college students. And just acknowledging that housing, food, transportation, childcare, and healthcare are the real challenges that they are facing today. And despite these challenges, most Americans say that post-secondary credentials are valued or extremely valued, even if they don't agree with the price tag. And most adults surveyed, almost 80%, actually want the young people in their lives to pursue some form of education beyond high school. And we know that we are facing converging challenges in which people not only say they value credentials, but employers will also increasingly demand workers with more education. We have from now to 2031 about a 17-point percentage gap that has to be filled to meet the future demand for workers with any form of education beyond high school, and about a 19 percentage point gap between the people who currently hold bachelor's degrees versus the number of people who will need to have bachelor's degrees to meet employer demands by 2031. Which is why it is so important that we talk about how do we move from workforce first to workforce first strategies. I know that that's a mouthful. And what does that mean? And these are the components as I see them, and that reflect my about decade of experience working with states on these exact strategies, and how policies and programs prioritize work first. The real challenge there is that they do so regardless of the wages that those jobs offer, the stability, or the growth. And education is often not prioritized in work first approaches. These approaches are also not grounded in evidence about what it really takes to move people into stability and to move them out of poverty in the long term. And work first strategies really trap people in a cycle of low wage work, hinders their own educational attainment and state educational attainment and workforce development goals. But conversely, when we think about workforce first strategies, what we see is that states are prioritizing credential and degree attainment. They're fostering an ecosystem of support that addresses non-tuition barriers, and their practices are grounded in evidence about what actually moves people out of poverty, reduces unemployment, and improves people's ability to complete programs, and most importantly, complete them in less time. These workforce first strategies really maximize federal and state investments in higher education, in public benefits and workforce development, and support states' educational attainment and workforce development goals. So when we think about what does that look like, all of the programs that you see on the left are what we think about as traditionally supporting higher education. And what we really need to think about is how to bring in and access non-tuition supports as part of that comprehensive system. And when we look across the programs that are really doing that, these are all of the programs that can support non-tuition costs with varying degrees of ease. Again, there's a lot of information on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of it because I want to make sure I have time to bring my wonderful colleagues onto the call. But each of these programs can support non-tuition cost. And we're talking about food assistance, cash assistance, childcare, housing, increasingly Medicaid, now that we've got new work requirements that will be getting rolled out in 2027, housing assistance, and other supportive services. States and institutions actually have a lot of flexibility over how they can access these programs. And we already know that we have large-scale, well-studied public benefit programs designed to cover exactly the non-tuition costs that derail students. So the question really is alignment, not invention. And how well, I decided to take a look at the data and see how well are some of these programs actually reaching the needs of learners. And we can see that across the temporary assistance for needy families or TANF program, only about 6% of people receiving cash assistance are engaged in some form of educational activity. Across SNAP for students enrolled at least half time, that's estimated to only be reaching about 33% of students. And for childcare subsidies, about 11% of people receiving a childcare subsidy reported the reason for receiving care as either education or education combined with work, which I think really demonstrates the degree of progress that we have to make and opportunity. And I also wanted to emphasize that federal and state governments spend tens of billions of dollars on Pell Grants and state and higher education funding, yet public benefit rules often treat education as a problem rather than the solution. But when our benefit systems make it harder to go to college, they undermine our own education and workforce investments. But when we align them, that same dollar works twice, once as an immediate support, and again as a credential to support credentials that boost earnings, tax revenues, and economic growth. So I really wanted to look at some of the numbers for illustration purposes. This is not all federal and state spending, but when we look across what we think about as public benefits, as employment and training supports, and federal and state higher education, we really see that we're not talking about just a $150 SNAP benefit for an individual student or a child care subsidy, which are incredibly important, but we're really talking about over $1 trillion in resources that we could be leveraging to better maximize education and workforce outcomes. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the impending cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. And so I just wanted to flag also as a way to highlight, sort of ring the alarm bell on why these conversations are so important, is that HR 1 is going to be cutting about $793 billion over 10 years in Medicaid spending. And this chart shows by state what percentage will states be experiencing. And the number of uninsured people is expected to increase by about 7.8 million. While when we look across SNAP cuts, my wonderful former team at the Institute for College Access and Success built upon an analysis that we started when I was there to really look at what cuts are states going to be facing from SNAP and what does that mean in the context of their state higher education budgets. And what we see for the state that would be impacted the most, at least in terms of their potential higher education budgets, the District of Columbia, their SNAP cuts or their SNAP spending that will be covered by their states would be represent about 45% of what the district spends on higher education spending. And in Florida, that's about 13%. So not all states are going to be impacted by the SNAP changes from HR 1, but about 40 states will be starting in fiscal year 2028, which represents about $120 billion that is going to be shifted from the federal government to states. And states are going to be forced to make really difficult trade-offs about who gets access to resources, what programs get cut, how to figure out how to allocate state spending in ways that are the least harmful. And when we look across all of these, we see that those federal cuts are going to amount to about $913 billion. So again, I'm a nerd. My question was, what was the decrease in state funding for public 2 and 4 year institutions over the 10-year period from 2008 to 2018? Because I have been saying, and multiple people have been saying, that these federal cuts are not just going to impact Medicaid and SNAP, but they're also going to have very serious implications for state higher education spending. And when you look at that in comparison, that amount was only $7 billion, not only $7 billion, but in comparison to the cuts that states are going to be experiencing over the next 10 years, we're facing some pretty extreme challenges. And so what I really want you to take away from this, I know, very lighthearted and uplifting conversation is it is imperative that we act now to avoid losing decades of educational attainment progress. The challenges that are facing higher education are going to require us to be increasingly strategic and resourceful to accomplish our goals in the face of less resources. And higher education's voice and advocacy in state and federal conversations have and will continue to play a really crucial role in the allocation and availability of these resources to support post-secondary education. So really thinking about not only the institutional practices, but really thinking about all of the systems that students interact with simultaneously while they're attempting to enroll and complete will be increasingly important. I'm going to stop there and we're going to share some additional state examples when we have our conversation a little bit later and invite my colleague Caroline to come on. Caroline, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Huh. Sorry about this. Just a quick second.
That's okay. You're almost there, Caroline.
Okay. From beginning. Great. So thank you so much for having me, Carrie, and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this and for framing the conversation. I did see a lot of folks who I know on the attendee list. So hello. And if I haven't met you yet, nice to meet you. My name is Caroline Trishita. I'm a senior government affairs manager at National Skills Coalition. In that role, primarily, I'm focused on federal advocacy with Congress and the administration around workforce development policies, but part of that includes picking up what states are doing related to credential attainment and demonstrating that good work or where there are challenges, opportunities to the administration and to Congress so that they can develop policies to remedy some of it. As I mentioned, I know there are some new folks, for me at least, attending. So just a quick intro into National Skills Coalition and who we are as an organization. So we focus on jobs that require skills training. So, I'm sure everyone in the audience knows, but those are those jobs that require more than a high school degree, but don't quite rise to the level of a 4-year degree. So you can think of apprenticeships, certificate, occupational licenses, etc., in fields spanning industries, healthcare, technology, IT, construction, etc. And so we advocate for a national commitment to inclusive, high quality skills training so that people have access to a better life. And so more local businesses can see sustained growth. So that's our main mission. We have been around since 2000, and this just lists some of the strategies that we use to affect change, such as technical analysis, policy analysis, organizing, advocacy, and communications. And we work to change policy at the state and federal level. I think really what separates National Skills Coalition from maybe some other policy organizations or think tanks is we develop these policies in hand in hand with folks who are doing this work on the ground. We leverage a national network to do some of that federal advocacy I was mentioning. We work with a state network, both formally in 20 states, and these are statewide coalitions that work to solve state workforce problems. And then we also work with business leaders across the country. So small and mid-sized businesses, we give them a common platform to advocate for their skills and talent hiring needs via Business Leaders United. And then another network we have is called Voices for Skills, which is where we hear directly from workers and students themselves. So all of these folks come together to help us create policies. And then these statistics, I think, really align with what Carrie showed and some of the data points she showed. This is some research that we did back in 2018, so it's getting a little older, but we have not really updated it because honestly, the percentages are still pretty similar to what they were in 2018, if not a slightly bigger gap or slightly more jobs requiring skills training. So as you can see from this pie graph, 52% of jobs, so the majority of jobs in the country do require and fall into that skills training category compared to jobs that require a 4-year degree or only a high school equivalency. And then at the same time, we are seeing that the most jobs in the country do require skills training, but there's this mismatch here of folks who don't have the skills that they need to enter into these good jobs. And that's sort of the problem that National Skills Coalition aims to solve by increasing access to holistic support, like Carrie mentioned, as well as a lot of other policies around workforce development. And then just a little more specifically to the topic of this presentation, I think the main question here is how is National Skills Coalition thinking about states' abilities to improve people's access to credential attainment? We have a pretty strong body of work around this topic. It falls under a campaign that we call Making College Work. So we leverage those networks that I mentioned to answer this question and to make college work for working people. And 3 of the main themes that we are seeing when it comes to states' ability is around strengthening industry partnerships. So partnerships between a community and technical college or another training provider and employers so that there can really be some simultaneous workforce development. So community colleges can create programs or other institutes of higher education can create programs that are responsive to employer needs. So getting those folks all together at the same table, as well as expanding those partnerships to community-based organizations, labor unions, governor's offices, et cetera. Those partnerships we see really just create a full picture for states to think about credential attainment. The other one is comprehensive supportive services, which Carrie outlined really well, but there's opportunity in a lot of workforce development policies at the state and federal level for folks to get those supportive services like childcare, transportation, career navigation, et cetera, that they need to enter and complete their credential. And then finally, one that I will talk a lot about today in our state examples, we see states making a targeted effort to improve their data systems as well as data transparency, and that being key to people's access to credential attainment. So thank you so much for letting me talk with you all today. I'm looking forward to the panel, and I will pass it over to my colleague, Jennifer.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Do you want to say something, Carrie? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that if people are interested, we're definitely going to talk a little bit more about Workforce Pal. So that will be coming up as well.
Okay. Can't get away from that, can we? Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you for having me today on the webinar. My name is Jennifer Stittard. I am a Senior Director of Government Affairs at Jobs for the Future. I've been here about a year now. I was actually Caroline's colleague at National Skills Coalition for a few years prior to that, and also spent a number of years on Capitol Hill, including the workforce staffer for the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. So at Jobs for the Future, honestly, workforce policy organizations all sort of have a little bit of a similar hilt. We're interested in building a future that works for everybody. Currently, our education and workforce system could use some help. We have 92 million Americans, or half of workers, are facing barriers to economic advantage and do not have a quality job. So we are essentially looking for for pathways for more people to find access to quality jobs, access to completion, access to success. We look at that a number of different ways. We have interest in apprenticeship. We have interest in work-based learning. We do post-secondary policy, workforce policy, and we also are interested in K-12, particularly secondary to post-secondary pathways and success. We have a mission that we would like everybody we want to make sure everybody has a pathway to economic success. And in order to do so, we partner with employers, we partner with higher education institutions, we partner with workforce boards, the apprenticeship system, nonprofit, other philanthropies, investment. In order to do this, we have a North Star goal that we would like to see by 2033, 75 million Americans who face barriers to good jobs and good employment find better opportunities. So now that I got through that elevator speech of what JFF does, I'd like to talk a little bit about the subject at hand and sort of thoughts on where the system is at today overall. I really do think right now we're at a bit of an inflection point when we're looking at higher education and workforce as a whole. And some of that is sort of the policies that we see happening around us. One thing I say often is that when you look at higher education and when you look at workforce policy, that is not a binary choice. You don't have to support traditional higher ed at the detriment of workforce, and you don't have to support workforce at the detriment of higher ed. You know, we don't necessarily need to take money from Harvard and give it to community colleges. That's not a choice that needs to be made. We can support both students. And I think as advocates for those students and for those communities, we need to recognize that. We've seen a lot of winners and losers lately in the way that policies are developed. I mean, one thing I can think of in particular is FIPSI grants recently. You know, certainly we don't need to necessarily take money from basic needs and other supports, veterans, in order to then benefit things like Workforce Pal or AI. We really want to be able to do the full gamut of things. And I think a lot of times we're following in that trap where we feel as though we have to pick one thing over the other. And that's not necessarily a choice that needs to be made overall. And I think in recognizing that, it's important, you know, for our traditional higher ed folks to better understand the workforce space and where folks are coming from there and sort of how that operates. And in the inverse, have workforce better understand those pathways for students to be able to move on to traditional higher ed space and why folks make those choices overall. And when I think about it a little bit, I mean, a lot of times I refer back to work that was done a number of years ago. It was under the Lumina Foundation, and it was the Today's Student Project. And what it really uncovered is that today's students face a number of challenges. It's not just cost. and it's not just time. We have a lot of parenting students. We have older students. We have students that have responsibilities, that are working part-time, that are working full-time, and the challenges of those students aren't just workforce students or traditional post-secondary students. It sort of runs the gamut. And when we think about policies that not only provide access, but also support for retention and completion, we really have to address those challenges and those wraparound supports at hand. And one way that we can sort of do that is a lot of times you'll see students, at community colleges and at the post-secondary space that might be non-credit, and they don't necessarily have the same access to services and to supports that you will see on the credit-bearing side. So, that's one way we can look at silos and breaking down those silos. I think, it's also important for our more traditional higher ed folks to kind of understand the motivations of students and why they're making those choices in order to develop policies around that. While a baccalaureate degree over time is going to earn a student more on average, a lot of students face challenges in entering the post-secondary space and taking on a 4-year degree. So being able to support those multiple on-ramps and off-ramps and understanding why a student may take that and how you can support students to make good choices in that is important as we look at sort of our post-secondary system as a whole. We're seeing the rise of a lot of different ways to kind of provide education and training to students in the way that we are assessing competencies. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but we need to fully understand that and why. How can we support students and how can we support more evidence-based policies around that? One thing that we see more and more is the rise of work-based learning. What does that mean? How do we define quality work-based learning, and how do we give students more opportunities for affordable work-based learning? Employers more and more are looking for those durable type skills, are looking for that type of experience, and having that work-based learning aspect built into not just, your non-credit programs or your shorter term programs, but your longer term programs as well, as becoming more and more important overall. I think we're moving out of the idea that, we're siloed within our community and technical college system and within our CTE programs within our K-12 system. Students aren't necessarily just taking cosmetology or woodworking. Like, there's a whole different aspect here of pathways that we really need to integrate in overall. We're seeing the rise of apprenticeship degrees. So you really have this marrying of spaces overall when we're thinking of, what is workforce, what is post-secondary, what is traditional higher ed. And we're seeing more and more pathways and options that are helping students, meet what employers need more and more. We also have a myriad of choices right now for students out there, not just in your 4-year space, but in your 2-year space, in your non-degree credential space. Credential Engine estimates that there's over 1 million unique credentials out there. So we really need policies that are going to uplift good programs, provide good data to students in order to better understand what types of programs they should take on and how states should be investing in these types of programs. And overall, it sort of comes back to a little bit what we're seeing in states right now and what we're seeing federally is a big focus on labor participation, on employment, on work. And how can we talk to states that are really interested in, we want to get more people to work, and understanding that it's not just putting people into the system, but putting them into quality jobs within that. And I think for some states that's more difficult than others. I'll give you an example. Right now, we're working a lot with Alabama. And Alabama is very interested in labor participation rate. They have a whole learning employment record system where we're looking at people's competencies, and we're creating an employment record for them to connect with employers and trying to get them into that space. But at the same time, they also have a definition around what is a quality credential. And their system is not only ideally trying to just say, okay, well, here's an employer match, but it's also saying, okay, well, here are the competencies you have, and here's how you might be able to build upon this in order to get a quality credential or an additional credential to further your learning and your goals. So I think there's a lot of different levers and ways that we're looking at things right now out there that can kind of help folks. Another area is around career navigation and what states are doing around data, not just helping K-12 students, but overall. Kentucky has a great SLDS system where they're then looking at data and how students are doing wage records so you can really track. This is the program I'm interested in. This might be the earnings. This is the demand. And then they're giving it to counselors to help people better understand what those opportunities and what those pathways are. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie so we can go into our Q&A.
Thanks, Jennifer and Caroline. That was really great. Caroline, do you want to join us on camera? We'll jump into our panel discussion. Thank you all very much. And I encourage everyone again, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll be happy to respond to those throughout the panel or towards the end. So our first question for both of you is, how are states approaching credentials of value and incorporating that into their higher education workforce development approaches?
Sure, and I'm happy to take that, Carrie. I think we've seen a number of states who've come up with a definition around what is a credential of value. And oftentimes that looks at things like wages. It looks at current demand. It looks at future demand. It looks like pathways, potential benefits. So there's a number of different things that the credential of value looks at, but a lot of times it's how is it connected to a job that is of quality, right? And it's great that states develop these frameworks, but they can't just exist in space. It needs to actually apply to something. So in a lot of cases, we're looking at, okay, well, how is it applying to financial support around students entering into these programs? How is it supporting decision making? I'll give Indiana as an example. So Indiana has a really cool interface on how they're looking at non-degree credentials. And I think the non-degree credential space is really a lot of times where, I don't want to say it's easier to look at it, but you have probably perhaps fewer occupations that are tied to a singular non-degree credential than you might have in like a medieval arts, 4-year degree. So it's a little easier to sort of look at those occupational codes and that tracking and see where students are overall. So essentially what they do is they call it a flame system. And it's sort of like, instead of 1 to 5 stars, you have 1 to 5 flames, I guess, because it's hot. I don't know exactly. I'm sure someone from Indiana could explain. But essentially, in order to qualify for certain financial aid programs, a program has to be a 4 or 5 flame. And what they're looking at there, they're looking at demand, they're looking at wages, they're looking at other types of quality indicators around that credential. So, it is a validator in a way to be able to get that type of aid. But you want to see a lot of career navigation around that. You want to see a lot of data and consumer information. And I think that's something that states are still thinking about, how you get that information out there. And I think it's challenging. I mean, I'll give an example. I heard that it was an institutional system that said they had this really great AI system that was like, if you go into it, it'll tell you what type of credential you should go into. So I was like, okay, I love a tool. I won't say who made the tool. I'm really curious about this. So I typed in my information a little bit. I kind of, maybe took it down a little bit, maybe 30s, not 40s. And it came and it said I should go into nursing. So I was like, I bet 90% of the people who fill this out should go into nursing. Just for background, I have a bachelor's degree in political science and have never worked anywhere except in the government or government relations. So it was a little bit of a stretch. So I think we're going in the right direction and the ideas are there, but we still need additional policies, data, support to kind of get us across the finish line.
Awesome. I am happy to add into what Jennifer shared about states creating their own definitions. I definitely want to pick back up on that, maybe in the next question about quality versus non-quality programs. But when I think about how states are approaching credentials of value, I picked out those three themes that you saw on the slide. So data collection, industry partnerships, and holistic supports. And I pulled a couple state examples that I think kind of demonstrate all three of those themes. So starting with the Louisiana Community and Technical College System. They have recently added non-credit students' records into their core student information system. So, treating non-credit and credit data students basically the same when it comes to data collection. That makes it a little easier on the student as well. If you're dual enrolled, you just have one place where you can enter all your information. And so then the Louisiana Community and Technical College System coordinated with workforce partners, so like the state workforce agency, local workforce boards, as well as student aid partners to understand just what Jennifer was saying about what's a quality program, like to understand the students' earnings and employment outcomes. So really tying it to like, does this lead to a good paying job? And so then that data was able to support more targeted program eligibility decisions. So Louisiana has a grant program, maybe some of you are familiar with it, the MJ Foster Promise Program, which supports students in short-term credit and non-credit programs. So then Louisiana was able to take that pool of money and make sure it was going to programs that have good results and prune those that maybe aren't delivering the way they're hoping to. And then just in terms of next steps, they're also hoping that this data can help inform statewide attainment strategies kind of at a higher level, and then also future funding conversations as well. I'm happy to give a second example, but I just want to check with you, Carrie, on time.
Yeah, I'm going to add to it and then we'll see if we have time to come back to that.
Great.
So I was thinking across particularly the programs like SNAP, TANF, and childcare, how our states ensuring that those programs are improving access to post-secondary education. And I think unsurprisingly, we'll see overlap in the states that we're referencing because some states are really leading in these spaces. And I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with the state of Kentucky since 2022. And I would recommend their childcare policies as an exemplar. So students who are enrolled full-time get full access to a childcare subsidy. And then students who are enrolled at least part-time get access to a childcare subsidy if they pair that with part-time work. And there was this really great example from an institution that had gotten a C Campus award that said our actual full-time students are getting such good support through Kentucky's childcare policies that we don't have enough students to give out C Campus resources to. So they had to work with the Department of Education to share those resources with a couple of local community colleges. And that's an example of a really well-designed childcare subsidy program. And then there are certainly other examples in the SNAP program, such as Washington State, who has a very, very robust SNAP employment and training program. California is really aligning their SNAP post-secondary eligibility around, it's called LPIs, local programs that improve employability. And then in TANF, the state of Nebraska, actually since the turn of welfare reform, has allowed post-secondary education to count as a work activity in recognition that post-secondary education is moving more people to economic mobility and off of public benefits in the long term. So a couple of really good examples there as well. I actually want to pose a question because this is something I struggle with. And if this is a curveball and you guys are like, why are you doing this to me? We didn't discuss this. One of the things that I worry about is in sort of the longer term thinking down to some like unintended consequences is I love that we are focusing on ensuring people get access to credentials and credentials of value so they can get their foot on the economic ladder. I think the thing that I struggle with is for who? For whom are we suggesting focus on short-term credentials and credentials of value? And I think my concern is that overwhelmingly we are, targeting people with lower incomes and people from minoritized and poverty impacted communities. And I worry about creating environments where traditional higher education becomes othered for some people and not for others. And I would just be really interested in your reactions to that because it's something that I actually worry about quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's a very difficult thing to try and answer, Carrie. Certainly when you think about students and you think about their motivations, a lot of times folks are looking for some type of quick fix. I don't want to say it like that, but they're looking for some type of accelerated way to get into a good job or what they perceive as a good job. And I think a lot of times what we need to think about is whether or not it's actually meeting their goals and understanding what that goal is. I always like to give the example of we were having issues, obviously, earlier this year with Job Corps. Okay. And I was sort of curious, like, well, what do Job Corps students really think about Job Corps? So I usually use Reddit for that. And because you have actual students posting on that. And I found it kind of interesting because there was one student that was like, yeah, I'm just about to start my CNA program at Job Corps. And people were like, why would you do CNA at Job Corps? And they were like, well, I really want to be an RN, but I don't meet the prerequisites for it. So, but the question is, are you really going to meet the prerequisites for it if you get a CNA at Job Corps? So I think it's kind of understanding, getting people where they want to be. And that might be a pathway that includes a short-term credential, but we need to make sure that's not terminal. And we need to make sure there are pathways to upward mobility. So bottom line is people are going to enter in and out of post-secondary education and learning. That's just sort of where we're at right now. So we want to make sure, though, that we're not sticking people in low-road jobs where they can't get out of it. So and I think sometimes what we want to do is we want to say, okay, well, we're going to make none of that eligible. And then people are still enrolling in it. We just don't know about it. So we can't ignore that people are enrolling things that we don't have any tracking of because they don't get state aid, they don't get federal aid. They still exist. So I think there are larger questions out there, but we really want to create pathways for people that we do understand what they're doing, what the wages are, what the outcomes are. But there is a certain level of self-selection and choice that we do need to let people have to a degree.
Caroline, you want to add to that? Anything you would add?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of what Jennifer shared, National Skills Coalition is right there with you. I'll actually point to a blog that our CEO wrote today and published with the executive director of Advanced Career and Technical Education, that organization. And it was about how pathways to colleges and careers must reflect young people's needs and aspirations. So really, just building on what Jennifer was saying, like, no one wants to get stuck in a low wage job. And I think another way we can do that is by ensuring that investments are happening outside the classroom as well. So investments in the full set of needs that young people and older Americans need to enter and complete a degree. And I don't know, to your point about othering, Carrie, I mean, I really hope it doesn't come to that, but I think just with the rising debt that it takes to finish a 4-year program, and I'm including myself in that category of folks, like, I'm hoping that it won't create an othering, but I mean, in an ideal world, these would be seen as either complementary paths that, both have pros and cons to them. And it really just kind of depends on your individual, career goals and path.
Yeah, thank you both for letting me throw you that curveball. Since this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about because I was one of those students from a low-income, diverse community that, didn't really see a pathway for college for myself. And
until somebody shared with me what was possible and encouraged me to dream. So I do worry about how some of these programs and investments are limiting people's own self-perception as well about, what they're right for and the contributions they can make in the world. So thank you for letting me get philosophical since I know we're all very deeply technical. And Caroline, if you guys have resources, feel free to drop them in the chat. I know people would love that. So if you want to share the blog, like, I'm looking forward to reading that. So, we do have other questions, but I want to go to the Q&A to make sure that we have a chance to respond to our participants. And then if we have some additional time, I'll come back to some of the other questions that we have. Andrew, do you want to read those off, or do you want me to go pull them? What are you thinking?
Well, I'll just go ahead and read the first one. Did HR 1 OBBBA restrict or expand states' ability to count higher education towards work requirements?
That's a great question, Randy, and I'm glad you asked it. So what I would say is that there were not explicit additional restrictions on post-secondary education, but there was an expansion of the ABOD work requirements, and we know there's going to be new work requirements in Medicaid. We do not yet know what the scope of educational activities are going to be included that either include or exclude somebody from Medicaid eligibility. That process is actually unfolding, and states will have an opportunity to weigh in on that. But I'm going to share a resource from, if you guys are not familiar with the American Public Human Services Association, they did a work requirements crosswalk, and it's phenomenal. They're an amazing organization. It's a wonderful resource. So if you want to dig into the specifics of those work requirement changes, that is the best resource to point to. Thanks for the question.
And I will add on it. I think states have some ability here to kind of build on what has been given.
Lots.
You don't have to just be like, okay, it's a work requirement, you're going to be employed. Like there's some utility here where you can sort of say, okay, well, yes, it's a work requirement or a training program, and these are the types of training programs we want to connect somebody to. So part of the issue, though, is states weren't really given a lot of money to implement this either, and there's a whole lot of new financial pressures around this. So I think we're at a difficult point to try and force states' hands. But as state advocates, I would encourage folks to at least ask questions, pointed questions around how this is going to happen and how this is going to work.
Mm-hmm. Carolyn, do you have anything to add?
I agree with what Jennifer said. And I'll also just add in there, if there are things that you want to do, to Jennifer's point, regarding work requirements, as unresponsive as the federal government can be, don't be afraid to ask the Department of Education, whoever your contact is there, whether it's a regional field manager, whoever, for some guidance around that, for some state TA, or, from some pointers from the federal government about how to meet your state's needs when it comes to work requirements and higher education. And especially if a couple people or a couple different states, especially red states, are asking for the same thing, that can definitely make a difference.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And I think,
is if anybody have attended the Basic Needs World webinar we did, I think back in December or November, that recording's on the website as well, but we went into a little bit more detail about
where do states have those flexibilities. That's actually an area that I've worked on the longest, of helping states maximize their regulatory flexibility to improve the scope of post-secondary programs that are included in work requirements. So if that's something anybody is interested in more details on, we'll be happy to provide that. And I do also want to flag that we're doing another webinar in February where I'm going to go through the specific interactions between SNAP, TANF, and childcare and how they intersect with post-secondary education. That's going to be, I think, a more technical session than this one. But if you're interested in some of those interactions and the state flexibilities, we'll have more information on that in February. Jennifer and Carolyn, do you want to add anything before we go to the next question? Oh, great.
Okay, the next question. I agree with the imperative and value of improving access to credentialing in higher education and creating better jobs, but how do we balance that with improving wages and benefits at jobs we consider essential that just don't pay a living wage or provide good benefits? If everyone in those jobs trains for a better or higher paying job, we will still need people in those jobs.
No one can answer that entirely.
I know.
That's been the quandary for 150 years. So I think I think what we think about at JFF is we don't necessarily have a lot of policies around employment, around wages, around what employers should be doing. We do have a quality job survey that we have released with some ideas around that. But I think a lot of what we focus on is giving people better information, giving people better opportunities. And when policymakers are looking to make investments in education and training, we want to make investments that give people good outcomes. So I know that's not like fully what you're looking for here, but
Welcome to late stage capitalism.
it's not easy to answer. I mean, certainly, when you think about women,
Yeah. I was gonna raise that point, Jennifer, from this question from was it Randy? I mean, for me, there's lots of important jobs that don't pay a living wage, right? For me, just kind of what comes up immediately is childcare, other care work. And, I think that is something that policy can help with. For instance, in the childcare sector, we're seeing a growth of apprenticeships for childcare workers and childcare careers. And so fundamentally, if it's going to be changed to an apprenticeship program, it's going to have some of those quality guardrails. But then, this is just one of those that goes beyond policy. Unfortunately, we know that the majority of people in these essential jobs that are not paid well are women, immigrant women, Black and brown women, or low income folks as well. And so there kind of needs to be a public narrative push that these are valued jobs, essential jobs, et cetera. So policy with some public messaging as well to kind of change hearts and minds, which it takes decades. And then just to for a resource on that, National Skills Coalition recently released a brief called Making Care Jobs Good Jobs, which provides some strategies and some examples for how we can start to move that needle of what a good job can be.
Yeah, excellent responses, Jennifer and Caroline. And the one thing that I would add is, yes to the narrative, and also,
without being able to affect the value of a salary in the job market, public investment has to be able to meet the needs for essential workforce like childcare workers, like the childcare workforce. And, without the ability to do that, what other tools and resources do we have available? And I'll give another shout out to Kentucky, where one of the things they're doing to improve the childcare workforce, the access to childcare, as well as figure out what you can do that isn't necessarily raising wages, is they are allowing people who are working in licensed childcare centers for their child to attend that center for free. So when you think about how do you expand the capacity of the center, and then how do you also provide, I think, a non-monetary benefit to the parent, it's a really interesting and exciting strategy. So that's, getting down into I think, something interesting to think about. Andrea, do we have any more questions?
No, that was all of those that came in the Q&A.
Okay, wonderful. If we have some more come in, let me know, but I'll go back to, we have a couple more questions that we were going to discuss on the panel. So you guys have talked a little bit about this, but we can come back to it again and see if we have anything to follow up on there, of how are states ensuring people have pathways to quality jobs with family sustaining wages versus low wage, low growth employment just for the sake of getting people employed? Are there any specific examples that come to your mind?
Yeah, I can start on this one. So we already talked a little bit about how many states are coming together around a quality consensus definition, or a consensus quality definition, whichever you want to put it. I think everyone on this call knows, quality, of course, does not just come from time spent in classroom, but of course, comes from can it lead to a quality job, good earnings? Is it stackable across, or it's stackable or portable across different classes and career pathways? So I think defining quality is one way states are, of course, thinking about it. And then just to bring in a specific example, I can talk about how Texas has shifted some of their community college funding towards, instead of all programs, credentials of value. And this is the first full year of consistent statewide reporting on non-degree credentials. And so they ensure quality by, again, developing kind of a cross-agency partnership between education and workforce stakeholders. And they emphasized to me that they really focused on simple, easy to collect measures of quality, because I think we all know institutional capacity is limited. They focused on keeping all colleges at the table throughout the process, and then also measuring over a few years. So highlighting how maybe one year wages can miss like the full complete story, and multi-year earnings can really kind of paint a full picture.
Can you get in?
Sure, I'll just give a quick example that's just a little different than sort of what we've been discussing. And, obviously both Caroline and I work for workforce organizations, and one of our primary interests is Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. And for those who are familiar with WIOA, there's a lot of different mechanisms one can get funding for with that. You have on-the-job training, you have incumbent worker training, but I think the big signature thing people think about is individual training accounts, or ITAs. It's sort of in some ways like the Pell Grant version of workforce, even though it's not really an entitlement. But in order to get that, you have to generally enter into a program that's on an eligible training provider list. And for those who have ever gone on their state's eligible training provider list, and it's not actually a provider list, it's a program list, which is super confusing. The programs on there are not amazing sometimes. You're like, wow, that's really expensive and doesn't have good wages. One state, they're not required to have horrible programs on there, though. And one state that's done like a lot around that has been New Jersey. And, they've worked with various stakeholders in the state. They've gotten buy-in from like the workforce boards, the community colleges, the employers, to really sort of use a more, data-oriented system and uplift the programs that are actually on their ETPL that people can enter into. So I would say that's an example of where folks are kind of doing good things around the workforce end.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the workforce piece of it, because, institutions and systems partnering with community partners, with their workforce agencies is incredibly important.
One of the pieces of research that keeps me up at night is the Government Accountability Office showed that there are 43 federally funded employment and training programs administered by 9 federal agencies. And so when we think about how that, both trickles down to states and ends up resulting in siloing, but also presents so much opportunity to think about how we're aligning programs, policies, and partnerships in ways that really maximize that funding, particularly in light of, we're going to be facing less resources in the future. I don't see any additional questions, and we only have a minute or two. So Jennifer, Caroline, I want to thank you for joining me for this wonderful discussion today. And thank you, everyone, all of our participants who joined. Please stay tuned for the webinar recording, and feel free to visit our website for additional events and opportunities. And thanks again, Caroline and Jennifer.